Hi, and welcome back to this second part in the mini-series on the historical reliability of the Old Testament. Last time we spoke about some general principles of the historical reliability of the Old Testament, and then we covered some of the most speculative early events with Noah's flood and the Tower of Babel. This time you'll be glad to hear that we're getting into more concrete history, and we can start with the Patriarchs. Again, we are still too far back in history to have concrete corroboration of specific people and specific events. We are talking about the early 2nd millennium BC, which makes these civilizations and events as ancient to the Romans as the Romans are to us. And the Romans kept far more records and they built far more robust structures. So our primary evidence here is circumstantial, which means that we have to see whether the details in the biblical narratives are realistic according to what we know from the time, place, and culture from other sources. Some of this evidence can be very impressive, especially if it is difficult to invent these details much later, as it would have been without access to encyclopedias and the internet. In fact, for the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, there is a lot of such circumstantial evidence, some of which is very specific to the time and place they were supposed to have lived. Here are just a few examples. We know that there was significant migration between Ur and southern Turkey, where Abraham moved from Ur. We know that long-distance marriages to relatives were common, as we frequently see in the Genesis accounts. We know that in times of famine, Egypt was often sought out for food, as with both Abraham and Jacob. We know that the treaties agreed between the patriarchs and others were similar to those made in the early 2nd millennium BC specifically. We know that the kinds of marriage and inheritance patterns that are described are realistic, and the kinds of worship described in those early accounts are also realistic for the time. We even know that the price paid for Joseph as a slave was the right price for slaves at that time, which changes over the Old Testament. And we know that in the rest of the Old Testament, the correct prices for slaves were consistently given in line with inflation. It is sometimes claimed that camels were not in the land of Canaan at the time, but this is untrue. We now know that they were not common, as they are today, but they were present. And a careful examination shows that this is exactly how the Bible portrays them. They were not common in the biblical narratives, but they were present on occasion. Now, there's a particularly striking example in the names of the patriarchs. And this is especially helpful because it suggests that the characters in particular are real. The names Jacob, Isaac, Ishmael, and Joseph in Hebrew are Yaakov, Yitzhak, Yishmael, and Yosef. These all use the same form of name known as the Amorite imperfective, which was very common in Mesopotamia in the 18th century BC. But it was not very common at other times or in other places. But this is exactly when the patriarchs were supposed to have existed. And these are also known to be the names of people specifically, not the names of tribes, as is often claimed. Likewise, we know that the names Abraham, Zebulun, and Asher are names specifically from this period, which would not have been made up later. Now, since the patriarchs were generally not involved in major political events, and since they existed so long ago, we can corroborate very little in terms of the actual events. But there is one particular event which might just be corroborated externally, though we are not certain. And it's exactly the sort of event we might expect, namely a war. In Genesis chapter 14, it says that some kings from western Mesopotamia allied together to fight Kedorlaomer, the king of Elam, along with his allies in the east. And Elam is in the very eastern part of the region. Again, the circumstantial evidence is strong. We know that these sorts of Western alliances were common, and we know that this was the perfect window in history for an Eastern alliance as well, where Elam was based. Outside of this small window in history, Eastern Mesopotamia was completely dominated by Ur beforehand, and then Babylon and Assyria after this time. And so it was only during this precise window in history that Elam had extensive involvement in the West and was able to put together an alliance of Eastern rulers. Moreover, the many names in the narrative fit their respective peoples from the different people groups. And there are other indicators in the story that it is an ancient story as well, such as the clarification of different names. And it is just about possible even that this war is the same event as described in the account from Yakdun Lim in the 19th century BC. We don't know for certain, but it is possible. But it is at this time, and at the time of the Exodus, that the circumstantial detail becomes really impressive. Although the Exodus is one of the most frequently challenged or doubted parts of the Old Testament, the evidence for it is actually particularly impressive given how long ago it was. Now, there are a range of potential problems with the Exodus account which are often brought up. It is claimed that there is no evidence of Hebrews in slavery in Egypt. It is doubted whether the plagues happened. The exodus of 600,000 people roaming through the wilderness is often doubted, as is the crossing of the Red Sea and many other issues. So we will look at just the particularly key elements. Again, it is worth starting here with our limitations, so that we don't have unreasonable expectations about what the historical evidence should show. Firstly, of course, all of this was over 3,000 years ago, which is reason enough not to expect too much evidence. We also know that almost all papyri from this period of Egypt have been destroyed, and that is despite part of Egypt being very dry and hence able to preserve papyri. In the Nile Delta region, which regularly floods every year, papyrus remains are extraordinarily scarce, close to non-existent. And that is, of course, where the Exodus took place from. We know, in addition, that slaves would have mostly used mud structures, which, of course, don't last 3,000 years in general. And we know that there are very limited natural stone deposits in the region, so it was difficult to get access to stone, which is the material which is typically best preserved from the period. All we have from Pi-Ramesses, where the Exodus started, are a handful of tiny written scraps. And of course, Egyptian pharaohs, like most other leaders, didn't write much about the times that they were defeated or humiliated. Despite all of this, though, the evidence for the different elements of the Exodus is substantial. We know that Egypt had foreign slaves, particularly in the mid to late 2nd millennium, which was specifically the time of Hebrew slavery. And we know that slaves were particularly taken from Canaan. Two of the key roles of slaves were for making bricks and tilling the land as described in Exodus. We also know from external history that targets were set, that there were 2 levels of oversight for slaves, that straw was included in the bricks, and that the slaves were beaten, all of course being in line with the biblical narrative. Outside of this period, these roles and slaves from Canaan in general were less common. The plagues, of course, have also been subject to much doubt. Now, of course, if they were fully miraculous, then there is no way that we could prove them in the modern day context by looking for the modern day equivalent. Miracles generally only happen once, and that is the point of them. But suppose they were natural events that had theological meaning, and that God used in order to achieve his purposes. Well, plausible attempts have been made to show how these sorts of crazy events could follow on from each other, even in a relatively natural way. For one particularly dramatic example, we even have Egyptian records describing the Nile as blood, and we know that red dirt in large quantities is able to turn entire rivers red. Here is just one example from a huge river in contemporary China. Well, what about the Exodus itself? We know that escapes of tribal groups from Egypt in the period are known, and this is not at all unprecedented. In fact, even for the specific route of the Exodus described in the Bible, we can map it out on Google Maps satellite view today. But the Exodus in the Bible started at Ramses in Exodus 1, chapter 11, which is now thought to be the city of Pi-Ramesses. This city was only founded at the start of the 13th century BC, and at that time it was the capital under Ramesses II. Yet by 1130, less than 2 centuries later, it was completely abandoned, with the stone being taken away to another city, Tanis. Now, what this means is that anyone inventing this account centuries later would probably not even have known about Pi-Ramesses, especially if they were not from Egypt. This is likely an ancient remembrance from the time itself. Pi-Ramesses was found again in the 20th century with stables for chariots and storage facilities, making it appropriately referred to in the biblical text as a store city. Two other sites mentioned in the early Exodus, Pithom and Sukkoth, have likely also been identified today. So one of the first things that happens is the slaves from Israel originally come to the Red Sea. And what about this parting of the Red Sea? Well, it is now generally recognized that Red Sea was a mistranslation and that Sea of Reeds is more accurate. Now, as you leave the Nile Delta into the Sinai Peninsula, you come across a series of lakes which in the 2nd millennium BC were linked by canals, which would have made them impenetrable to a large group of people fleeing in this way without boats. These bodies of water have salt-tolerant reeds in particular, and they are particularly notable, partly for that reason. They have even been known to move or change course as a result of strong winds, and this was seen even with one visitor there in the World Wars in the early 20th century. So again, it might have been God using natural phenomena, or it might have been completely miraculous. Either way, the ecological data cannot rule it out. There is no way to disprove what happened there. But a key challenge here is the number of people. It is generally agreed that 603,000 people moving around the desert is somewhat implausible. But again, we might be victims to mistranslation. The Hebrew word for thousand is ambiguous. It can refer to 1,000, or a group, or a leader. And so probably it refers to 603 groups or leaders with groups, and hence is much more within the realm of plausibility. Now, when the Israelites left the Delta and moved into Sinai, Exodus chapter 13, 7-18 says that God did not lead them by the way to the land of the Philistines, although it was near, for God said, "Lest the people change their mind when they see warfare, and so return to Egypt." Now, this is exactly what the archaeological evidence suggests, that on the simpler and quicker and shorter northern route through Sinai, where the Philistines were based, there were a long line of forts and settlements, and indeed the excavation of these sites suggests that they were very active in this exact period. But even under Ramesses III, these military settlements were already beginning to fade from relevance. Likewise, the rest of the route through Sinai allows us to connect the biblical narratives with all sorts of familiar modern-day phenomena. Various wells, springs, palm trees, mountains, a second stop at the Sea of Reeds, conflict with the Amalekites, migration of quails even, and in one remarkable case, even getting water by striking the rocks there, which sometimes have water underneath them. So what about the tabernacle? Well, this is particularly impressive evidence of the antiquity and ancient origin of the Exodus story. And this is important because many liberal scholars suggest that the Exodus story was invented many, many centuries later. So the timing of the story and the fact that it understands ancient phenomena well shows that it genuinely is an old story. So what about the tabernacle in particular? Well, it used to be thought that this was invented by the Jews in exile many centuries later, inventing it in retrospect. But what we now know is that these sorts of dismountable, movable structures were particularly common in Egypt from the 3rd millennium onwards. Indeed, non-Egyptian structures were typically completely different. And in fact, the very closest example we have to the biblical tabernacle was specifically the royal tent of Ramesses II, who was probably the best candidate for the pharaoh of the Exodus, which suggests that this Exodus story and the tabernacle really was from this specific time. Now, these structures were typically wooden structures with tent covers draped over them. They had sockets, as described in the Bible, corner fittings, and so on. Even the furnishings within the temple were similar to Egyptian structures of the period. Likewise, when we look at the covenant made by God and his people, we see that in the same way that modern-day treaties change over time in their format and in their contents, we can also categorize ancient treaties into different time periods because of their own distinctive features. And so once again, it turns out that the covenant between God and the Israelites was exactly appropriate in its format for this specific time of the Exodus. And of course, anyone inventing this half a millennium later would not be able to get this right, trying to invent something from 600, 700, 800 years earlier. So all of this suggests that even though Moses is not himself directly described outside of the Bible, someone like him would have been needed to bring all of this together. The movement coming out of Egypt and producing these documents and the tabernacles would have needed a Semite who was literate, who was familiar with international politics, and who was familiar with Egyptian tabernacles. But they also needed to be completely different in terms of their social views and values. They needed to have Semitic social views and values. They needed to be Jewish. We know that Ramesses II had foreigners in his court, and actually in many cases Ramesses sent these foreigners to be properly educated. And so Moses, being a foreigner in the court of Ramesses and getting a proper education, would not have been out of place at the time. And so all of these factors point to the same date, around the 13th century BC. And in fact, they fit that date with such precision that it would be impossible to invent much, much later outside of Egypt. These accounts ultimately describe a real time and a real place. But one of the most striking things about this is that just after this time, there were enormous demographic changes in the land of Canaan, with enormous increases in the population of Judea seemingly out of nowhere. From 1210 to 1150, over just 60 years, the population of central Judea increased fivefold. And perhaps most interesting is that these new settlements didn't have pig bones, which of course suggests that they were Israelite settlements specifically. And so all in all, the timing fits suspiciously well for an event which was supposed to be invented centuries afterwards. Now finally, it is sometimes said that there is no evidence of widespread destruction of Canaanite cities from this period, and there's no evidence that Israel ruled a huge area of the land, from the land of Aram up at the very top, north of Israel, down to the Negev desert at the very bottom. But if we read the Bible carefully, the Bible does not actually claim that the Israelites did these things. It generally says that the Israelites raided cities and then settled alongside the Canaanites rather than destroying them. Only a handful of sites were actually destroyed in the biblical accounts of the invasion of Canaan. Moreover, although the Israelites planned to take a huge portion of Israel from the very far north to the very far south, the Bible never actually describes them doing so at this period. Specifically, they fail to do so. And hence it is no surprise that the archaeological evidence also suggests that they failed to do so. And so finally, it is perhaps no coincidence that at this same time we find the very first references to Israel in external sources, specifically on the Meneptah stela from around 1208 BC. All in all then, the evidence comes together to suggest that the Exodus narratives are ancient and specifically from a 13th century Egyptian context. The massive expansion of seemingly Hebrew settlements in Canaan at the very end of this century is particularly striking. And there is therefore no substantive reason to doubt an Exodus around this time. Now, you will have thought throughout this talk that it might not be exactly as we learnt the Exodus growing up, but we have translators in earlier times to blame for that, not the Bible. In summary then, we have moved from prehistory in the first lecture to the earliest recorded history in Genesis and Exodus. Now at this point, we're still mostly lacking specific individuals in external records, but this is exactly what we would expect. On the other hand, we are finding striking correlations between the narratives and what we now know about the relevant times and places from archaeology. So as we go to the next lecture, we'll move into much more concrete history with the establishment of Israel as an actual nation capable of making waves on the global stage. At this point, other countries begin to interact with Israel, and therefore we see much more recorded about what happened in Israel and about the people within it. So I look forward to seeing you then, and thanks again for listening.
Hey guys, how are we doing? My name's Nadia and I'm part of OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. and we just want to say thank you for watching our video. At Ocker, we love to look into the big questions facing our time and our culture to see how the Christian faith gives answers that are both rational and rich in their understanding. If you enjoyed this video and you want to come along with us, then why not check out the rest of the content on this channel? Please consider subscribing and following as well, so that we can keep on making content like this. We really want to hear from you guys, so if you have ideas of questions that we can look into or content that we can make, then please drop a comment down below or get in touch with us directly. We want to say thank you as well to the speakers, to the donors, to the filmmakers, and also to you guys for making it happen. You know, it takes about 60 hours to create a film like this, and that's because we want it to be carefully researched. We want the talk to flow beautifully, and we want the filmmaking to be smooth. But that all takes time. And here at Ocker, our staff are funded by people who share our vision. So if you want to partner with the work that we are doing, please consider donating. I'll catch you next time.